The morning at the precinct was filled with the usual hustle and bustle. Officers milled around, talking about the latest cases, the weather, and, most notably, the arrival of a new police chief. The precinct had been buzzing with anticipation, but no one seemed to know much about the mysterious individual who was set to take over the department. Whispers of the new appointment circulated as officers tried to make sense of the change in leadership. Some were excited, while others, particularly those who had been with the department for years, were skeptical. Probably another desk jockey who knows nothing about the streets, Officer Ryan Blake muttered dismissively, his voice laced with a mix of irritation and arrogance. He had been with the force for over a decade and believed his experience on the streets made him superior to anyone else in the department. Blake, a senior white officer with a reputation for questionable behavior, had long dismissed any efforts at diversity or change. He often used his position to belittle others, particularly minorities, whom he didn't respect. As the officers continued to gossip, a car pulled up in front of the precinct. A woman stepped out, casually dressed, yet her confident stride suggested a sense of purpose. She was carrying a large official envelope, but to those observing she seemed like any other person coming to visit the precinct. She didn't fit the image of a police chief in the minds of many. Danielle Harris walked up to the precinct doors, blending in with the crowd of civilians and officers outside. She paused for a moment, taking in her new surroundings, and then confidently entered the building, unnoticed by most, until she reached the front desk. The receptionist greeted her, but the woman simply nodded and made her way toward the chief's office, the official envelope still in hand. Only then did Officer Blake, who had been making his way toward the back of the precinct, look up and take notice. Unbeknownst to Blake, the woman he had casually dismissed in the parking lot was about to completely change his life. Danielle hesitated as she walked up the imposing steps of the precinct. It was a grand building, with an aura of authority that could intimidate anyone. But Danielle wasn't anyone. She had earned her place, not just in this city, but in this building. She glanced down at the official envelope in her hand. The weight of it, the decision inside, was nothing compared to the weight of the responsibility she had taken on. She had worked hard for this moment, and she wouldn't let anything stand in her way. As she reached the top of the stairs, she could feel eyes on her. Several officers stood outside, engaged in conversation. Among them, Officer Ryan Blake leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, wearing his typical smug expression. He was one of those officers who assumed his experience in the field made him above the rest. His dismissive attitude toward change and authority was well known in the department, but today it was about to meet its match. Blake's eyes narrowed when he saw Danielle approach. He quickly sized her up, taking in her attire, which didn't scream police chief. To him, she looked like someone who didn't belong in such a setting. Without hesitation, he strolled over to her, his footsteps heavy on the stone steps. "Hey, sweetheart, this isn't the welfare office. You're in the wrong place," Blake said, his voice oozing with condescension. He looked her up and down, sizing her up, an amused smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Danielle paused for a brief moment, taken aback by his dismissive tone, but her resolve remained unshaken. "I'm here for business," she replied calmly, her voice steady and firm. Blake wasn't deterred. He scoffed and stepped closer, blocking her way. "Sure you are. Maybe try the courthouse steps if you're looking for attention." His words were sharp, intended to belittle her, and his gaze remained dismissive. scanning her like she was out of place. Danielle didn't flinch. She had dealt with people like him before, and she wasn't about to let his behavior rattle her. But Blake, sensing her composure, pushed further. He took a step forward, his body language becoming more menacing. "You think you can just walk in here and tell us how to do our jobs?" Blake sneered. He looked around, as if expecting the other officers to back him up, but most of them kept their distance, unsure of how to react. Danielle could feel the eyes of the other officers on her, but she stayed focused on Blake. "You're blocking my way, officer," she said, her voice unwavering. "If you'll move, I'll take my business inside." Blake, not used to being spoken to this way by anyone, let alone a woman, scowled. "Not so fast. What makes you think you have the right to come in here and boss us around?" He mocked her with exaggerated body language, gesturing toward the precinct doors as if she had no place in front of them. Danielle stood her ground. "I don't need your permission, officer. I've earned the right to be here just like everyone else, and you can choose to either step aside or keep making yourself look foolish." Blake's face reddened at her calmness and strength. He could sense that she wasn't going to back down. But instead of doing the right thing and letting her pass, he decided to escalate. He crossed his arms, his stance becoming defensive and hostile. "I think you should just leave," he muttered, his voice low but filled with contempt. "You don't belong here." Danielle took a deep breath. She wasn't going to let him ruin this moment for her, not when she had worked so hard to get here. She glanced over her shoulder at the other officers, who were all watching, some nervously, others with curiosity. They were waiting for her to react. With a final, resolute glance at Blake, she stepped forward and brushed past him, her shoulder lightly grazing his as she moved toward the doors. She didn't say another word, but her quiet confidence made it clear that Blake's childish intimidation tactics had no effect on her. As she pushed open the doors to the precinct, she didn't look back. Blake stood there for a moment, fuming. He had expected her to back down, to flinch, but she didn't. He cursed under his breath, unable to comprehend how someone so seemingly out of place had just effortlessly dismantled his petty, racist behavior. He watched her disappear into the building, a moment of realization slowly dawning on him. He had just made a mistake, and he had no idea how big of one it was. The moment the doors to the precinct swung open, a few curious officers glanced toward the entrance. Word quickly spread that a commotion was unfolding outside. As the scene continued, more officers trickled out into the parking lot, and a few civilians passing by paused to watch, wondering what was happening. Some younger officers, already familiar with Danielle's reputation for fairness and professionalism, shifted uneasily as they observed the growing tension between her and Officer Blake. They exchanged uncomfortable glances, but remained silent. It was clear that the older, more experienced officers were reluctant to intervene, perhaps too aware of Blake's behavior over the years, but unwilling to confront it. Meanwhile, others, including the more brash officers, couldn't help but chuckle nervously at the situation. They seemed to enjoy the spectacle, but their laughter had a hollow, uneasy quality. Something about the whole interaction didn't sit right with them. Danielle stood at the base of the precinct steps, holding her ground, her gaze fixed firmly on Blake. She remained composed, knowing that her response would set the tone for the future interactions in this precinct, especially with an officer like Blake. "Do you treat everyone like this? Or am I just lucky today?" Danielle's voice was calm and steady, but there was a firm edge to it that left no room for misinterpretation. Blake's response was quick and laced with a sense of false bravado. "Just doing my job, "Keeping the riffraff out of the building," he retorted. He folded his arms across his chest, his posture smug. "We can't have people like you causing trouble." At his words, the murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Some officers exchanged looks of disbelief, and a few civilians shook their heads. Danielle's poised reaction was clearly a contrast to Blake's increasingly hostile tone. Danielle's eyes never left his as she took a step forward, closing the distance between them without flinching. Her voice was measured but firm, cutting through the tension in the air. "And what do people like me look like, officer?" Blake froze for a moment. The question seemed to take him off guard, though for just a split second. He hesitated, perhaps momentarily questioning the weight of his words. But the fleeting moment of self-doubt quickly passed, and his arrogance returned. He sneered, taking a step closer to her. "You know exactly what I mean," he said with a dismissive wave. "People like you don't belong in positions of power. You just got here because of your qualifications. You're not part of this, of us." The remark hung in the air, thick with racial undertones. The crowd of onlookers grew tense, some even stepping back, sensing the situation was about to boil over. The younger officers exchanged knowing glances, clearly uncomfortable with Blake's words, but most of them kept their distance. They had seen Blake's behavior before, but hadn't yet witnessed anyone challenge it with such composure. But Danielle wasn't backing down. She stood tall, her eyes piercing into Blake's with unwavering confidence. There was no hesitation in her voice as she spoke again. "And what exactly are people like me?" she asked, her tone unwavering. "What's the difference between you and me, officer, other than the fact that I've earned every position I hold through dedication and hard work, while you hide behind your badge to elevate yourself above others?" For a brief moment, Blake seemed stunned. His eyes flickered, as if he hadn't expected this kind of response from the woman he had underestimated so easily. The crowd quieted as Danielle's words sank in. The air was thick with tension, as Blake's defiant stance wavered, but he quickly recovered, his ego fighting back against the realization that his words were not having the desired effect. "You really think you can talk to me like that?" Blake snapped, his jaw clenched in frustration. "You're nothing but a desk jockey. We're the ones out here on the streets, dealing with real issues. You're in there behind your desk, making decisions, but you've never had to face what we face. You don't understand the real world." Danielle's gaze softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "I understand enough, officer. I understand the importance of every decision I make, and I understand the responsibility that comes with the position I hold. I'm not here to make excuses for you, but I will hold you accountable, as I hold everyone else accountable." At that moment, the other officers began to shift. The more junior officers who had been reluctant to get involved began to take a more active interest in what was unfolding. A few even began muttering amongst themselves, with some starting to step forward. They were witnessing a turning point, a moment where someone was finally standing up to Blake and calling him out for his behavior. Blake, realizing that his confrontation was losing ground, looked around. The tension in the air had shifted. He could sense that he wasn't just up against a woman he had underestimated, but against the weight of a systemic issue, one that could no longer be ignored. His smug attitude faltered, and for a moment, just a moment, he seemed unsure. His shoulders slumped ever so slightly as he processed the weight of his words and actions. But instead of apologizing or backing down, he shot a final, venomous glare at Danielle, turning away and walking off to join his fellow officers. As he walked away, Danielle stayed where she was, unshaken. The message had been sent. The atmosphere was different now. The crowd had witnessed something important, something that could change the course of their department and maybe, just maybe, bring about the change needed. The actions of one woman had forced the man who had been allowed to act with impunity for too long to face consequences, publicly, in front of his peers. As the tension in the air continued to hang over the precinct, the doors to the station swung open. Captain Morales, a well-respected officer with years of service, stepped outside, his eyes immediately locking onto Danielle standing at the base of the stairs. His expression shifted from curiosity to alarm as he recognized her. With military precision, he immediately saluted her. "Chief Harris," Captain Morales said with respect, his voice ringing through the quiet. "I didn't expect you to arrive so early." Danielle didn't flinch at the formality. She had already recognized Captain Morales's respect for authority. She returned the salute with a nod, maintaining her composed and confident demeanor. But it was at that very moment that the reality of the situation set in for Officer Blake. Blake, who had been watching the exchange from a distance, froze. His eyes widened as the words sank in. His smug expression faltered. His posture stiffened, and for the first time that morning, the arrogant swagger he had carried so easily began to crumble. "Chief?" Blake stammered, disbelief creeping into his voice. "You're the new chief." The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The woman he had dismissed so casually, assuming she was just another civilian unworthy of his attention, was now revealed to be the one person in charge of him and his fellow officers, the new chief of police. Blake's jaw tightened as his thoughts raced, but no words came out. His earlier assumptions, his condescending remarks, and his racially charged comments, everything he had done in the last few minutes, had just been exposed in the worst possible way. Danielle, meanwhile, stood unshaken, her eyes never leaving Blake's stunned face. She calmly responded, her voice unwavering and confident. "I was trying to introduce myself, but it seems some of your officers have unique ways of welcoming people." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, cutting through the tension with precision. The crowd, still gathered, remained silent, unsure of how Blake would react. But there was no escaping the truth. The man who had been so ready to humiliate her had just been handed the most public dose of humble pie. Blake's face flushed crimson, a mixture of frustration, embarrassment, and anger flashing across his features. But instead of standing tall, instead of defending himself with the usual arrogance, he simply stood there, frozen. The realization that the new chief of police was not only a woman, but also someone he had wronged publicly, was too much for him to handle. For a moment, it looked like Blake might say something more, perhaps try to justify his actions, but no words escaped him. The shock of his own ignorance and prejudice had taken the wind out of his sails. Captain Morales, now fully aware of the situation, stepped forward. His gaze softened slightly as he turned to Blake. "I'll make sure the department knows you've met Chief Harris," he said firmly. The implication was clear. Blake's actions were being noticed, and he was now on thin ice. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation between an officer and a civilian was now an introduction of the new chief. Blake was not only disrespected, but his actions were now under scrutiny, making him vulnerable in ways he had never anticipated. The power dynamics in the room had shifted. Danielle's presence, calm and collected as ever, was a silent statement. She had made her point clear. No one, not even an officer with years of service, was above the law or allowed to undermine authority. especially not because of personal bias or prejudice. As Blake's expression darkened, Danielle turned back to the group of onlookers. The people who had been silently watching this entire exchange now understood the gravity of the situation. Their murmurs turned into whispers of awe and respect. What had started as a personal insult to a woman in the wrong place at the wrong time had quickly turned into a moment of profound reckoning for one officer and an eye-opening experience for the others. Danielle's calm demeanor remained a striking contrast to Blake's rattled state. The scene before her was a powerful reminder of the responsibility she had just inherited, and she was ready to face whatever challenges came next. The real work had just begun, and she would not allow anyone, especially someone as entrenched in bias as Officer Blake, to undermine her authority or the respect that the job demanded. With that, she turned back to Captain Morales, signaling that the matter would be addressed, and with one final glance at Blake, she entered the building. Her first moments as chief had already proven one thing: she was no stranger to standing her ground. Blake stood frozen at the foot of the stairs, his mind racing as he scrambled for words. His face flushed with panic, and his mouth moved, but no coherent explanation came out. I didn't mean," he stammered, desperate to cover his tracks. "It was just a misunderstanding. I was just doing my job." Danielle, her posture straight and unwavering, did not react to his stumbling excuses. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the precinct, her eyes sharp with authority. Without saying another word, she stepped inside, Blake trailing behind her, though no one followed. His presence was now insignificant, his actions on the edge of being questioned by someone who had more power than he could ever have imagined. Inside the precinct, Danielle wasted no time. The officers who had witnessed the scene outside had already begun whispering among themselves, their murmurs punctuated by the faint sounds of their radios. Danielle's voice cut through the chatter like a blade. She stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding, as she addressed the gathered officers. "Respect is the foundation of any police force," she began, her voice steady and resonant. "Without it, we're no better than the criminals we're sworn to protect people from." Her words echoed in the room, silencing everyone in their tracks. Even the most hardened officers couldn't help but reflect on her message. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air. Danielle's eyes swept across the room, landing momentarily on Blake, who now stood in the corner, his face pale, still struggling to understand the full scope of the situation. She could see the apprehension in his eyes, the realization that his career, his reputation, hung in the balance. Blake finally spoke, attempting to defend himself, but Danielle's gaze silenced him immediately. "Officer Blake," she said, her voice firm, "we will be conducting an immediate review of your conduct. This is not the first time your behavior has raised concerns, and we need to address it." She let her words linger in the air before continuing. "This is bigger than just one incident. It's about setting a standard, making sure that the officers we entrust with power act with the integrity and fairness required of them." The room was silent, each officer aware of the gravity of the situation. They all understood that Blake's actions were not just a personal failing. They were a reflection of systemic issues that needed to be confronted head-on. They had seen Blake's behavior before, the way he interacted with those he deemed beneath him, and many had quietly tolerated it. But now, with Danielle in charge, they knew things would change. This wouldn't be swept under the rug. Danielle's final words resonated in the room, an unspoken promise that she would hold each officer accountable for their actions. "We are here to serve everyone with dignity, not just those we choose to respect. And that will be non-negotiable from this point forward. As Blake's fate hung in the balance, Danielle stepped forward, signaling the start of a new era in the precinct, one where accountability, integrity, and respect were the cornerstones of their work. Danielle Harris had always known what it meant to fight for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against her. Raised in a tough neighborhood, where opportunities were limited and violence was all too familiar, she learned early on that survival was not just about physical strength, but about resilience and the ability to rise above the circumstances around you. As a child, Danielle dreamed of becoming someone who could make a difference, someone who could fight injustice without becoming a part of it. Throughout her youth, she watched the struggles of her community with a growing sense of frustration. She knew the systemic inequalities that plagued her neighborhood all too well: discrimination, police brutality, and the lack of opportunity for people who looked like her. It was a world that often felt indifferent to her dreams, but Danielle refused to let it define her future. Determined to be a force for change, Danielle worked tirelessly to earn a scholarship to law school. Her path was anything but easy. She had to work 2 jobs while studying, often balancing textbooks with late-night shifts at a local diner. At law school, she was often the only black woman in her classes and faced an uphill battle against biases that were deeply ingrained in the legal system. But her resolve only grew stronger. After completing law school, Danielle joined the police force, where she was met with a new set of challenges. The police department she joined was steeped in tradition, and, for someone like her, a black woman with a law degree, breaking into the ranks was no easy feat. Her colleagues were skeptical of her at first, with some questioning her abilities and others dismissing her entirely. But Danielle proved them wrong with every promotion she earned, and soon she had the respect of her peers, both for her intellect and her unwavering commitment to justice. Her leadership and achievements didn't go unnoticed, and eventually, Danielle was appointed as the first black female police chief of the city. It was a historic moment, not just for her, but for the community she had worked so hard to serve. As chief, Danielle made it her mission to change the culture of the department. She implemented training programs on racial bias, fostered community policing initiatives, and created a space for people who had historically been marginalized by the system. For Danielle, this was more than just a job. It was a calling. She knew she could make the police force a place of fairness and accountability, where justice wasn't defined by skin color or power. This commitment to changing the culture from within drove every decision she made as chief, pushing her to face challenges head-on, no matter how difficult. And the moment she stepped into the precinct that day, standing up to Officer Blake, was just one example of her dedication to making sure that respect, fairness, and integrity prevailed. The room falls into a hushed silence as Danielle Harris stands before the officers in the precinct's main hall. It's her first day as a police chief, and she feels the weight of the moment. With calm but unwavering authority, she begins to speak, her voice steady and clear. Integrity, equality, and accountability are the foundations of our work here. We are not just enforcers of the law, but guardians of trust, she says, her eyes scanning the room. This badge doesn't just signify power, it signifies responsibility. And it is a responsibility that we all must carry with honor in every action, every decision, and every interaction. As she speaks, Officer Blake stands at the back of the room, visibly uncomfortable. His hands clasped tightly in front of him, he knows his behavior will not go unnoticed. The eyes of the precinct, many of whom had heard whispers of his actions, are now on him. Danielle's words pierce the silence, a direct call for change and accountability. She finishes her speech, looking every officer in the eye. Respect isn't given, it's earned, and I intend to lead by example. The room holds its breath, the power of her words settling into the hearts of the officers. For Danielle, this is just the beginning.